welcome to this very special edition of The Fine Print, discussing the Nuclear Disarmament Conference right here in Tehran with the slogan, Nuclear Energy for All, Nuclear Weapons for None. Joining me right here in the studio, Alexander Pikayev, co-director of Carnegie Moscow Centers for Non-Proliferation Program. Gunnar Westberg, professor of medicine, also a board member with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And Jonathan Granoff, president of Global Security Institute. And last, of course, not least, Professor Mohammad Marandi, head of the North American Studies at University of Tehran. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, guys, you have attended the nuclear disarmament in Tehran. Let's start with a quick take on what you guys went through, your own personal experiences. Let's start with Alexander Pikayev.
Well, no one would believe that International Nuclear Disarmament Conference could be held in Tehran, so when I was invited, I was very curious, but of course committed to come. And I think that conference was interesting because you cannot find such a big variety of people from academia, governmental officials, religious scholars, and people from so different countries like the United States, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, and even Belarus.
Great. Well, yeah, what the interesting point was, it's a surprise that, well, it's Tehran holding a nuclear disarmament conference, and I'd like to have your expansion of that surprise later in the show.
Yes, and it may be a surprise, but not completely so. I mean, it could be taken also as a propaganda trick, but I don't think it should be seen as that. But if I tell this story in most countries in Europe, they would say it's just propaganda, the whole thing.
What's your take? I mean, you've been there.
Yeah. Certainly, I feel very strongly that there is a very strong feeling in this country that you are under attack. You are criticized unfairly so for your nuclear energy program and the enrichment on uranium. And you are using this conference to try to make it known in the world that you have no intention to make nuclear weapons at all, which I don't think there is at this time. Things may change, and maybe when you got sufficient enrichment going, maybe these external circumstances will make the politics change. I don't think so. I hope it will not.
All right, let's go to Jonathan.
Thank you.
His take, Jonathan.
Well, the opening was a statement by the Ayatollah Khomeini, in which he said that nuclear weapons were haram, absolutely unacceptable morally, and I thought that was extremely clear, forceful, and I agree with him completely. And you couple that moral imperative with President Obama calling for the security of a world without nuclear weapons, which is a practical imperative, and also talking about America's moral obligation to work for a nuclear weapons-free world, which he said in Prague. And I was saying to myself, there's an enormous amount of common purpose here. And so I was listening the whole time to find places where the walls of fear that have been created can be changed to bridges of trust. And I'm never cynical. I always want to take people in their best possible way. And the best possible way was stated right up front. Nuclear weapons are haram. No one should have them.
Well, the interesting point you just brought up was the Iranian side is saying nuclear disarmament, nuclear energy for all, nuclear weapons for none. Apparently, the American president is pretty much saying the same thing. He says, world without nuclear weapons. Let's ask for Professor Marandi's take, and then we'll discuss all the points brought up here.
Well, I wasn't invited to the conference, so I can't comment on that. I think that in general it's a very good idea, especially since Iran really doesn't have much of a voice, especially in today's world where the Western media dominates throughout the globe, for the most part at least. And it's a good any opportunity to bring in academic scholars and experts to be able to see and hear the other side, I think is excellent, and I think therefore the idea is a very good one. In general, I think it's important for people outside of Iran to understand, or at least a Western audience, to understand that Iran is a very highly independent country. The revolution was partially about independence and no longer being like what Saudi Arabia is today, or Egypt, a client regime. And the nuclear program is a part of that sovereignty, and especially since billions of dollars had already been invested in the program before the revolution, the Iranians continued to pursue it. And it is interesting that it's not the only alternative source of energy that the Iranians are pursuing. You see that Iran has built a number of wind farms. Solar energy is on, the usage of it is on the rise in the country, and other, these alternative forms of energy are also progressing alongside the nuclear program. And the fact that Iran has a very clean slate with regards to weapons of mass destruction. After all, when Saddam Hussein received chemical weapon technology from Western countries and he had their backing and he used them against the Iranian people, the Iranians never produced or used chemical weapons, and they do not have them today, despite the fact that they're much more easy to obtain. So I think that Iran has a good track record, and that this opportunity to bring people here to Iran, experts and academics, is an excellent opportunity for people to get a better understanding of what's going on in the country.
Speaking of that understanding, let's see whether or not the people in this panel, those who have attended the meeting, have reached that understanding, the understanding Mohammad just talked about. Well, the gentleman to my left, Jonathan, brought up a very interesting idea. Just a few days before this conference, we had a similar conference in the U.S. that was nuclear security, with President Obama repeating what he said last April, in Prague, moving toward a world without nuclear weapons. And, well, he believes there's an interesting parallel here between what the Iranian president is saying, well, nuclear energy for all, nuclear weapons for none. So what is the difference here, Alexander?
Well, actually, it's not a question for me, maybe for President Obama or to Iranian leaders, because we poor Russians were not organizers of any of those meetings. We develop our relations with the United States not against anybody else. And we sent a message to Washington by sending high-level delegation to Tehran that we want to continue cooperation with Iran. We want to hear Iranian leadership and Iranian people. We want to engage Iran into a global discussion on nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament, nuclear security, because it's all global problems. And the fact that Obama administration didn't invite three very important nations in this realm of nuclear security, first of all Iran, second North Korea, and the third Belarus, which refused from nuclear weapons it inherited from the Soviet Union 15 years ago. It was not invited to Washington. Without those countries, of course, nuclear security cannot be achieved. This is why it is very important to follow global approach in this area. And the second thing, it's important to cooperate not against anybody, but to cooperate for something.
Speaking of global approach, I'm bringing up a question that would also concern you, but now I'm going to Gunnar on that question. All right, speaking of nuclear disarmament, the United States and Russia, of course, possess 90 to 95% of nuclear warheads in the world. They, well, signed a New START treaty a couple days before the President Obama's nuclear security conference, and a couple of days after his nuclear doctrine. But many still believe, hey, look, we've had so many of these START treaties. I don't know, when do these START treaties actually start? We've had START, SORT, so on and so forth. Just back in 2002, there was a similar, it's deja vu all over again. So speaking of nuclear disarmament, where did these treaties go? I would come back to you on this question too, but what do you think?
Well, when you say it's deja vu all over again, what you're saying is it's going too slowly. So it goes step by step, very small steps ahead. And that's one thing. The second thing is that because President Obama and his administration no longer talk about a specific endpoint, we are going to zero, we're going to abolish nuclear weapons, they have lost credibility when they talk about non-proliferation. If you read the papers by the four statesmen, Schultz, Perry, Nunn, and Obama, and Kissinger, in the Washington Post in January 3 years ago, they emphasize this, that if there is not a clear vision of going to zero in the foreseeable future, non-proliferation is not credible, because we have to have disarmament according to the Article 6 of the NPT, complete disarmament from the nuclear weapon states in order to avoid proliferation. As long as these countries cling to their deterrence, to their nuclear weapons, other countries will want them.
That's an interesting point, because you can't want nuclear weapons. This is interesting. We're talking numbers here. President Obama said, all right, we've signed this treaty. Hopefully by 2017, we're going, let's say, 1,500, 2,000, from 5,500, 6,000, whatever. A, who's counting? This is one of the questions people are asking. Is there a, like an independent agency like the IAE that would go to like the United States and Russia, like how many warheads you guys get? Who's counting? A, that's just one of the questions people in the world would perhaps have, which is a legitimate question. B, so what's happening to these treaties? And C, what's in the numbers? Because, well, many would say that you're talking about scrapping the old weapons, the big ones, the huge ones that are leaking, so on and so forth, they're dilapidated. And we have fourth generation of nuclear weapons. We have upcoming arsenals. We have a new budget in the U.S., the nuclear doctrine for modernization of nuclear program. So whatever is happening to this disarmament you guys talking about? What do you think?
You can look at the START treaty and say, it's still going to leave at least 1,500 nuclear weapons pointed on the same alert status they were at the height of the Cold War. The world still remains under tremendous risk. A few hundred of these would destroy the climate on the planet for civilization everywhere. Everyone is downwind in this face-off between Russia and the United States. There's the oops factor, I call it, a computer glitch, and we've had many of them where they've almost gone off and destroyed civilization. In addition, the cuts are not irreversible. There's no commitment that this is it. We can't rebuild it. We can't put them back online. And even with the cuts, there's still around 20,000 existing in the world. However, at the height of the Cold War, there were 80,000. So this is a huge shift. But what's important is the human atmospherics. There's a clear intention, and they have signed the treaty, and they said this is a start of a process. This is not the same as the so-called SORT Treaty of 2002. That had no verification. That was a sort of a treaty. This is a real treaty. It has verification. Is it enough? Absolutely not.
He said something interesting, Alexander, that, well, it's a surprise that this world thing is being held in Iran. Nuclear disarmament,
Yeah.
We're talking nuclear weapons disarmament, while Iran does not possess nuclear weapons. But Iran is, of course, trying to send out a message before the NPT review conference that is the coming month in New York. Now, Professor Marandi, it's kind of interesting. One country that does not possess nuclear weapons is holding a conference on disarmament. Those that do possess nuclear weapons, 95% of the world's nuclear weapons, plus those other countries, non-signatories to the NPT, like Israel, India, and Pakistan. Well, and then everybody's talking about the Iranian nuclear threat, including President Obama. So how do you see, there's a dichotomy here. So what do you make of this?
Well, I think this is not the only problem. It's also something that concerns Iran and Iranians in another way as well, and that is that after the recent Obama nuclear posture review and statements made by Obama and Gates, it was specifically stated basically that and meant that Iran and a couple of other countries are an exception, and that they as non-nuclear weapons countries can be attacked by the United States with nuclear weapons. And this caused a great deal of outrage in Iran and among Iranians. Although it's hypothetical, it's theoretical, there's no reason to think that the United States is actually going to use nuclear weapons against Iran. But I think for many Iranians this was very upsetting absurd and outrageous. And interestingly, the Western media really made nothing of it. Whereas you constantly hear the rhetoric that Iran wants to annihilate Israel,
Yes.
which is itself propaganda, because Iran never spoke, or no one in Iran ever said that they will annihilate Israel or use nuclear weapons, because they, first of all, never said that. They always say that they will not produce nuclear weapons, and also the Iranians believe that Israel must cease as a political entity, in other words, Palestinians return. So Iran is accused of threatening to annihilate another country. The rhetoric is all over the Western media. It's completely untrue. Yet Iran is threatened with a nuclear strike, yet there's a huge amount of indifference in the Western media and, of course, among Western countries.
What do you guys say to this? This is interesting. It's getting kind of complicated. When you're living in the West and you hear the word Iran, it's just Iran and the nuclear program and Iran building a bomb. That's what you're hearing.
And death to America.
And death to America, so on
And
and so forth. This is
terrorism.
and terrorism.
And fear.
And fear. This is what you hear.
Yeah.
Guys, you're here. I mean, is this your first time in Iran?
No, but my experience every time I've been here has been extreme cordiality, not just a nation, but a culture.
A nation of terrorists.
No, not a nation of terrorists, a nation of tremendous warmth, generosity, intelligence, and vibrancy. And when I tell my neighbors that I'm coming to Iran, their response is, "Will you be safe?" And the thing is that the most popular poet in the United States and the most popular poet in Iran is Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, which is the affirmation of our common humanity and the most beautiful part of us. But this cycle of fear has got to stop. And there are many, I keep looking at all the missed opportunities at this conference, all the ways in which security could have just jettisoned forward. My country's got to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We've tested nuclear weapons 1,100 times. Iran, when I go to push for ratification of the Test Ban Treaty, American politicians say, well, what about Iran? They're genuinely afraid. There's no reason why Iran can't ratify the Test Ban
what's
Treaty.
in it, guys? What's in it to demonize Iran all this much? I mean, what's in there?
And Iran could change it, could ratify the Test Ban Treaty, open itself up for whatever inspections are wanted, and say, we want the whole world to do this. That would help out enormously. And likewise in America, people like myself coming back and saying, these people are not necessarily our enemies.
Let me ask you this. The Iranian side would say, wait a minute, we did that for 2 years, 2.5 years voluntarily, and what did we get?
Anything you do in this country is suspect in the eyes of the Americans. I mean, the United States needs an enemy. We'll have to accept that situation. Colin Powell said that a long time ago. We were running low on enemies, you know. We only have Cuba and North Korea left, but then came Iran, you know, it's the salvation for the military-industrial complex of the United States. So you have to play that role, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. But wait 10 years and China will be the big enemy, you'll be forgotten. So just
that was interesting. But Alexander, speaking of the general mood prevalent right now, Iran is throwing this conference amid all these accusations and all of that. Sanctions. President Obama is globetrotting because his people, like all the people around him, are globetrotting to get all the countries on board for sanctions. Well, to major countries, permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, your country, and China. So what are we waiting for? The Russians, you're hearing mixed messages?
Well, you know, here there are two types of sanctions. One type of sanctions are American, imposed by the United States unilaterally, and as a result of which people suffer. You cannot buy even spare parts of American Boeing airplanes, and it of course is direct danger for Iranian people. And these sanctions were imposed unilaterally, and they really creates problem for Iran. Other sanctions.
Let me ask you, before different types of sanctions, sorry to jump in. The Iranians' question is, why sanctions to begin with? Guys, we are trying to build a peaceful nuclear program. We need to have a fuel cycle for that. We want to be independent. Why? Because you guys, the West, are not even giving us spare parts for our planes. People are dying as a result of plane crashes. So The Iranian side of the issue is not, the West is begging the question to begin with. We have two types of, sanctions, one including the Russians at this point. Before talking like different types of sanctions, why sanctions? This conference the purpose is to tell the world, guys, we are peaceful. It's haram, as you said, it's against our religion, it's against everything, and besides, it's quite useless. It's suicidal. Why would Iran need nuclear weapons? But we do need a peaceful nuclear energy. So why sanctions to begin with?
Well, actually, unilateral sanctions were imposed before debates on Iranian nuclear program started, and I think they were motivated by U.S.-Iranian relations, bilateral relations. We have
but then
nothing
again, we got
to say about
rounds
that.
Of UN Security
But
Council
regarding UN Security Council sanctions, first, one point of them is to freeze foreign accounts of some Iranian politicians who don't have foreign accounts, who are honest enough not to have foreign accounts. How it affects even those politicians, tell me. So these sanctions are so small, it is so short list of those sanctions that they do not create, frankly speaking, significant problems for ordinary people, for Iranian economy. It is just a signal, a message, which may be empty message, because there is very little behind that. That we don't like some things. What we don't like is that, there was some activity which was discovered in 2002. Most likely it was completely legal, but still it was not properly declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this problem should be solved. What we want, we do not oppose Iranian peaceful nuclear program, but what we oppose is that what we want is that Iran and International Atomic Energy Agency would solve. We need that both sides would solve what really happened, whether that activity was legal, whether that activity was illegal, but it should be solved, because otherwise there is no trust.
Right.
So we sent this signal, but frankly speaking, it's not anything ruining.
It's interesting. Speaking of signals, it's very interesting. You talked about the symbolism of this and this being a signal, because we just had a report out by New York Times that those major companies, one of those companies that was doing business both with Iran and the U.S., that was interesting to me was Halliburton, because up to 2007, the end of 2007, that is 7 years into Dick Cheney's vice presidency in the U.S., Halliburton is doing business through subsidiaries out there with the Iranians. So many believe this is all about symbolism. Some say this is about demonizing Iran. This is about so on. But I'd like to bring in Professor Marandi on this. When we're talking sanctions, the Iranians' question is why sanctions to begin with? And then the Iranians, the politicians say these sanctions, the 3 rounds, even though they're coming from the UN Security Council, they're illegal. How would you explain that?
Well, I think I should add that the sanctions have affected, for example, the banking sector, and it has caused difficulty for ordinary Iranians as it is today. And I've spoken to physicians who've had difficulty bringing in machines for hospitals from abroad because they were called dual-use equipment, and so it has caused trouble for patients and ill people. From the Iranian perspective, of course, the nuclear program was always legal, and any disclosure was made within the framework of international law. All the questions that were raised early on in 2000, in the 5, 6, 7 years ago, they were discussed, especially during the Larijani period when he was the head of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council, and the IAEA was satisfied with the Iranian responses. So those issues have been resolved. For the Iranians, what is important is that there is no evidence whatsoever that Iran's nuclear program is anything but peaceful. But what is extraordinary for Iranians is the amount of pressure that is that the Americans are trying to impose upon others to increase these sanctions, which from the Iranian perspective are unjust, because the Iranians are not going to give up their nuclear program under any circumstances, because it is now an issue of sovereignty. And the more they push, the more the Iranians are going to be adamant. And I think that further sanctions will only deteriorate the situation and take us down a very slippery slope towards potential confrontation. And that is something in which everyone will lose out. There will be no winner. and the United States, of course, will be one of those losers.
I really hope that the people in Iran understand that President Obama is not an ordinary president. This is an exceptional human being, and he has brought exceptional people into the government of the United States, people who actually want to live in a world at peace.
The Iranians are telling him, we're not from Missouri, but show us.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have to push. We have to push him. We have to push the government here. The people of the world